The road home felt narrower than it used to be. Pines leaned in over the old two-lane like eavesdroppers, their branches dusted with a powder of early snow that fell in slow, hesitant flakes. My wipers ticked a steady metronome. I hadn't driven this stretch in 7 years, and yet my hands remembered the turns, as if muscle memory had kept a secret all this time. At the last bend, the Mitchell house rose from the white like a postcard that had faded at the edges. The porch light was on an orange eye in the dusk, and in every window, a Christmas candle burned with the calm, fixed flame my mother always preferred. I pulled into the drive and let the engine idle for a beat. The air inside the car smelled faintly of coffee and winter coats. I could have sat there until the heater clicked off, but the porch light, that unblinking invitation, made lingering feel like a dare I was too old to take. When I stepped out, the cold was clean and immediate. My breath showed itself. Gravel crunched under my boots the way it had when I was a teenager sneaking back past curfew, when I believed time would always be on my side. I grabbed my overnight bag from the back seat, locked the car, and stood for a second to look at the house. The wreath on the door was real pine, tied with a red velvet bow my mother would have ironed flat. A strand of warm, white lights lined the gutter in neat clips. Nothing multicolored, nothing blinking. Mitchell's did not blink. Through the front windows, I could see shapes moving: my father's squared shoulders, my brother's easy silhouettes, the two of them turned toward each other in conversation that looked effortless from a distance. I felt the old pull in my chest, not longing exactly, but the tug of a knot that had never fully come undone. I adjusted my scarf, willed my expression into something neutral, maybe even pleasant, and climbed the steps. The door opened before I could ring. My mother stood there in a cranberry sweater with a tiny sprig of holly pinned at her collar. Her hair, once the color of wheat and now more silver than not, was swept back into a clip. For one suspended moment, her eyes searched my face like a photograph she knew and yet hadn't seen in a while. "Clara," she said, and her voice carried both welcome and relief. "You made it." "I made it," I echoed, and then we were hugging, the kind you don't plan and can't quite contain, the kind that presses the years out between you like air from a pillow. She smelled like cinnamon and something floral that reminded me of Sundays. When she let go, she took my hands and held me at arm's length. "You look good," she said. "You look happy." "I'm okay," I said, which was the closest I could get to truth without unpacking a lifetime on the doormat. "Come in out of the cold," she said, stepping aside. We just sat down with drinks. The house had that precise warmth I remembered, cozy without chaos. Christmas had been laid across it like an overlay, tasteful and controlled. A garland draped the banister. The nativity scene was arranged on the console table in the foyer, the porcelain figures evenly spaced, nobody crowded. My mother took my bag and set it by the stairs. "I'll put this in your room later," she said, which told me something about her hope. In her world, people stayed where you put them. Voices drifted from the living room, the low hum of my father, the deeper chuckle that belonged to Edward and Samuel's quick, bright punctuation. I braced myself in a way that felt both ridiculous and necessary, then followed my mother toward the sound. They were gathered around the coffee table, glasses set on coasters, a bowl of mixed nuts, exactly where it had always been, the nutcracker beside it, like a small tool of diplomacy. The room smelled like the spruce tree that rose almost to the ceiling, wired discreetly to the wall, I noticed just in case. In the glow of the tree lights, my father turned his head, saw me, and rose with a measured efficiency. He wore a navy sweater over a white shirt, the collar sharp against his neck, and his hair thinner now, grayer, was combed with the same right-hand part he'd insisted on since I could remember. "Clara," he said, not unkindly, not warmly. The syllables ran straight as a line level. He crossed the rug, kissed my cheek once, and stepped back. "Good to see you." You too, Dad, I said. The words had no safe place to land, but at least they didn't break anything. Edward stood, and then Samuel did, each of them moving with the easy synchronicity of men who had practiced being sons in this room their whole lives. Edward hugged me in the self-possessed way he did everything. He was the eldest by 3 years and wore it like a suit, well-fitted, a little formal, never quite relaxed. Samuel's hug was looser, warmer. He smelled like cedar and a hint of cologne that aimed for casual but had been carefully chosen. "You look great," Sis Samuel said, stepping back with a grin that sought common ground. "West Coast is treating you?" "Something like that," I said. Edward was already handing me a glass of wine. My father gestured toward an armchair, the one angled slightly away from the tree, not in the main triangle of conversation. It was the chair he always offered me, and I took it without comment because the choreography of this room, like so many others here, was not a conversation, but a map. Small talk was the language we all shared when nothing risked being said. How was the drive? Did the roads get bad past the county line? Did I remember the Petersons' old place? Apparently, they'd finally sold. My mother asked if I was staying 2 nights or just 1, and I said I'd see how things went. She nodded as if that was exactly the answer she'd expected, and not at all the answer she'd feared. The mantel clock hummed along hands approaching 5. My mother kept one eye on the kitchen like a conductor checking the percussion. "We'll sit down at 5:30, she said. "Roast will be perfect then." "We're ready when you are, Diane," my father said, using her given name the way he did when he wanted to sound respectful and in charge. Edward and Samuel were comparing notes on something that involved suppliers and timelines, the way 2 people in a shared world compare weather. My father listened without pretending not to. Even here on Christmas, the business ran like a second pulse. I sipped my wine and let the room arrange itself around me. There was a moment in every return when I felt like a guest at my own table, a friendly outsider walking through the set of a show I used to be on. 7 years were both a blink and a lifetime. "Dinner," my mother said finally, as if she'd conjured the word into the air. She stood and smoothed her sweater. "Clara, would you mind carrying the rolls?" "Of course," I said. In the kitchen, the windows had fogged at the corners from heat and breath. The good china was stacked on the counter, and a line of serving dishes sent up steam in soft frills. My mother was a person you could set a clock by, and the table across the hall had been laid with a precision that would have embarrassed a ruler. Place cards waited where they always did, my father at the head, my mother at the other, Edward on Dad's right, oldest son's privilege, Samuel on his left, me opposite Samuel. The chairs creaked familiarly as we sat. We bowed our heads, while my father said grace, the familiar cadence of gratitude, delivered in a voice that didn't bend easily. He thanked God for family and health and the success of the year. He asked for wisdom in the year to come. He did not mention me by name, but he didn't mention anyone by name. It would have been an innovation. Plates were passed. The green beans were crisp. The roast marbled and glossy, the potatoes whipped to a clean, pale cloud. Conversation at the table stayed in the safe channels, at first weather, neighbors, supply chain noise, the football game on later. The candles burned steadily in their brass holders, their flames sitting upright like students in a strict classroom. At some point after the second pass of the gravy boat, my father set his fork down and folded his hands. The shift was slight but unmistakable, like a key turned quietly in a lock. My mother glanced up from her plate and then quickly down again. Edward reached for his water and didn't drink. Samuel leaned back a notch, attentive without realizing it. I felt in the thin space between my ribs the subtle change in the air, a draft from a door that wasn't visible but had definitely opened. "Before we get too far into dessert," my father said, and in that first phrase, I heard the structure, the preface that meant he had something to announce, and he wanted the table's focus. "I have a few things I want to say while we're all here." No one spoke. The house seemed to align itself with his voice. Even the mantel clock, which had ticked in companionable rhythm with the meal, sounded suddenly like a metronome in a quiet rehearsal hall. As you know, my father continued, looking first to his right and then to his left, acknowledging the two sons who anchored him like parentheses. This has been a strong year for the company. We've tightened operations, grown the client base, and positioned ourselves well for the next 5 years. Edward and Samuel have each stepped up in significant ways. He turned to Edward. Your cost reduction initiative saved us 6 figures without sacrificing quality. Edward inclined his head, the modesty that knew it would be noticed. And you, my father, said to Samuel, the new account you brought in from the East region, well done. It should carry the company through the first quarter. Samuel gave the small salute he saved for moments when our father's approval landed on him without conditions. Across the table, my mother's fork hovered over her plate, as if it had forgotten what it was for. My father cleared his throat. I'm proud of the business, he said, as if pride were a ledger entry and accrual you recorded at close. I'm proud of the work we've done to keep it what it is, a family enterprise that has supported this house, and frankly, this community. He paused. The pause had weight to it. When he resumed, his gaze moved to me, not sweeping, not lingering. It arrived and settled with the neutrality of a level placing its bubble. Now, he said, part of responsible stewardship is planning. I've met with the attorneys. We've reviewed the estate, the succession, the whole picture. He clasped his hands together on the tablecloth, fingers interlaced. The skin across his knuckles was drier than I remembered, and a small scar I'd never noticed before nicked the back of his right hand near the thumb. In the interest of transparency, I think it's important the 3 of you know how things will pass eventually. The fork in my hand found its plate without making a sound. I felt my mother's glance like a draft and didn't meet it. Edward sat straighter. Samuel's jaw worked once and then stilled. The business, my father said, will go to the boys. It was so plain, so unadorned, that the absence of euphemism made a tiny sound of its own. He could have said sons. He could have said your brothers. He could have said heirs. He chose boys, a word that fit in his mouth, not because they still were, but because, in this context, they always would be. So Dad continued, we have decided the legacy will go to the boys. The house, the company, and all the assets attached. Edward and Samuel will be responsible for it and will benefit from it. And you, Clara. He paused, his voice as flat as a wooden board. You will not be part of the inheritance. The room was silent. No spoons clinked. No chairs moved. Edward glanced at me, then looked down at his plate. Samuel pursed his lips as if about to say something, then stopped. Mom took hold of her wineglass, her fingers trembling slightly. I looked straight at Dad as if to keep my balance. His face didn't change the look of someone who was sure everything was in the right drawer. For him, sons inherited, daughters just visited. The old rules were old-fashioned, but never out of date. Thank you for being so direct, I said. Calm. No shaking, no bitterness. He nodded, relieved that I hadn't disrupted dinner. He picked up his fork, cut into the meat, and considered the matter settled. Samuel glanced at me, his voice low. You know, it wasn't you. It's the company. I understand, I said. It's the company. We continued eating as if nothing had happened. The meat had cooled, the beans crunched under our teeth. The atmosphere was so heavy that the table seemed about to tip over until my mother saved it with her usual ritual. Who wants coffee and mint cookies? Coffee? He said, relieved that there was an escape. I'll help you. I stood up. In the kitchen, steam misted the windows, the coffee grinder, and the refrigerator filled the silence. Mom opened the cake box, her hands too skilled for comfort. For a minute, we were just setting up plates, scooping ice cream, no one speaking. Then she put down the knife and touched my hand. Clara, she whispered, almost so that no one but me could hear. I'm sorry. That's your father. He thought he was doing the right thing for the company, for the family. He didn't see how hurt you were. He just looked at the plan. I shook my head. I know. I didn't come back here to change him. I just wanted to know I could sit here in this house and hear that and not fall apart. Her eyes sparkled. You're stronger than we all thought? She turned away, took a knife, and cut the cake. I'm glad you're back. I'm glad too, I said, and I realized it was true. We brought the cake and coffee to the table. Dad nodded his thanks, as if Mom and I had just brought him the documents he had requested. Edward opened his phone, then stopped setting it on the table. Samuel exhaled, as if letting go of a burden. We ate the peppermint cookies. The coolness cut through the bitter aftertaste. The football game was on the TV, creating a common language, so we didn't have to search for words. We cheered, sighed, and shook our heads. At halftime, Samuel brought up the year the power went out, and we ate toast by candlelight. Dad laughed. Edward added details. Mom added a gentle smile. Night fell. I carried my bag up to my old room. The room was tidy, the sheets were smooth, the nightlight gave off a soft yellow light. The air smelled faintly of cedar from the scented sachets Mom kept in the closet. I sat on the bed, listening to the clock downstairs ticking steadily. The words Dad had just said were still there, but the sharp edges had dulled like a knife left on a cutting board for too long. I could clearly see the old wound, but it was no longer bleeding. I no longer needed recognition, no longer waited for an inheritance. I had built my own path, something my father could never sign or take away. Outside the window, snow covered the sill, glistening under the yellow light of the yard. I lay down, pulled the covers up. In this house, I was no longer the child waiting for my father to call my name. I was myself whole, even when rejected. That Christmas night, I understood there were doors that would never open to me. But I could still walk in head, held high heart intact, and continue my own journey. I grew up in a house where rules were hung heavier than Christmas wreaths. The Mitchell home on Maple Street looked from the sidewalk like a picture of comfort, a colonial with white shutters, a porch swing that creaked with memory, a yard trimmed to suburban precision. To outsiders, it looked like a place where nothing bad could possibly happen. But inside, life bent toward one center of gravity, my father's voice. Richard Mitchell wasn't a tyrant by the dictionary's definition. He didn't shout, didn't slam doors, didn't raise a hand. But his word carried the weight of unbreakable law. He built Wilson Manufacturing out of a garage, and the company was the cathedral where all devotion was to be directed. He carried that same discipline into the home. Meals were at 6 sharp. Shoes off at the door. Grades were to be high manners higher, and silence was preferable to an opinion that diverged from his own. My brothers learned early how to thrive in this system. Edward, the eldest, absorbed my father's worldview like sunlight on glass. He excelled in math, sports, and every task that bore the stamp of masculinity. Samuel, younger than me by 2 years, was the charmer. He carried a smile that melted even my father's hardest critiques. He didn't need to be perfect. He only needed to be liked. Together, they occupied the pedestal built in the living room, the ones meant to inherit not just the business, but the mythology of what it meant to be a Mitchell. And me, I was the middle child, the daughter wedged between sons, the note in the chord that didn't belong. My father had a phrase he wielded like punctuation whenever I showed too much interest in the shop, or asked questions about accounts, or suggested I could learn the same as Edward. Business is a man's world, Clara. Not cruel, not shouted, simply stated as if it were a law of physics. My mother, Helen, softened the edges where she could. She gave me sympathetic looks across the dinner table, pressed a hand over mine when my father's words landed like stones. But she never contradicted him. She belonged to a generation of women who believed standing behind their husbands was a form of loyalty, even when it looked a lot like surrender. So I learned to find my sanctuary elsewhere in school, in books, in the library's dusty corners, where no one measured my worth by my last name. Math was the first place I found freedom. Numbers didn't care about gender. Equations never told me I was unworthy. And when Mrs. Anderson, my high school computer science teacher, handed me a printout of basic code and said, "See if you can figure this out," something in me ignited like a pilot light catching flame. I remember the classroom humming fluorescent bulbs, the faint smell of chalk, the buzz of ancient desktops lined up like soldiers. I typed a string of commands, hit enter, and watched words appear on screen because I had told them to. It felt like magic I had conjured with my own fingers. "You have a gift, Clara," Mrs. Anderson told me later that year. "The world is changing. Technology is the future. You could be part of building it." I held her words like contraband. At home, I didn't repeat them. My father thought computers were for hobbies, not livelihoods. When he caught me staying late in the lab, he shook his head. "You should be at home helping your mother," he said, "not fooling around with machines." But by then, the fire was lit. I devoured books on coding, borrowed manuals from the library, taught myself new languages on weekends. Every keystroke was an act of rebellion. Still, rebellion in the Mitchell house carried consequences. One evening, I mentioned casually at dinner that I'd been accepted to the advanced math track, which meant spending more time in the computer lab. Edward got a congratulatory nod. Samuel got a laugh about how at least one of you has charisma. When it came to me, my father said, "That's fine, Clara. But don't forget, no man wants to marry a girl who thinks she's smarter than him." The potatoes on my plate went cold that night, though I ate them anyway, because silence was safer than protest. By junior year, Stanford had become the North Star I steered by. Their computer science program was the gold standard, and Silicon Valley shimmered in my imagination like a city of possibility. While my brothers were polishing resumes for business internships and learning the vocabulary of quarterly reports, I was building programs in the dim light of the lab, dreaming about California. The day the acceptance letter arrived, I cried in the kitchen, holding that thick envelope with both hands, as if it were proof I wasn't invisible. My mother hugged me so tightly I could feel her heart pounding. When my father came home, I handed him the letter, trembling with anticipation. "Stanford," he read aloud, like it was a foreign word. "In California? That's ridiculous." I tried to explain the program was one of the best in the country, the professors leaders in the field, the connections invaluable. He waved me off. "The family business is here. Besides, do you know how expensive that school is?" I had done the research. I explained the scholarships, the grants, the aid packages. But there was still a gap, a large one. I told him I'd applied for a competitive scholarship that could cover the rest. Weeks later, when the rejection letter came, I sat across from him in his office, a room heavy with leather and cigar smoke, his desk towering like a judge's bench. "Dad, please," I said. "I'll work harder than anyone. I just need the tuition." His eyes never lifted from the papers in front of him. "Your brothers need to focus on business degrees to take over the company. That's where family money goes. Your computer thing, it's just a hobby." "It's not a hobby," I whispered, but he had already turned a page, dismissing me with the movement. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, fury and heartbreak tangled in my chest. If he wouldn't invest in me, I would invest in myself. I deferred admission for a year. That year nearly broke me. I waitressed mornings at the diner off Route 6, slinging coffee to truckers who called me sweetheart. Afternoons, I folded shirts at the department store until my fingers ached. Nights, I did bookkeeping for a mechanic who paid in cash. Every dollar went into a jar I kept hidden in my closet. By the end of the year, I had scraped together enough to combine with loans and the smaller scholarships I had won. When I finally set foot on Stanford's campus, it felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. But college was brutal. While other students were buying textbooks without glancing at the price tag, I was calculating whether I could skip dinner to make my meal plan stretch. While dorm mates joined sororities, I worked late shifts tutoring underclassmen. Sleep was a luxury. Debt was a shadow. But every lecture, every late-night coding session, every breakthrough was fuel. The harder it was, the more it felt like proof that I belonged. Back in Oak Ridge, Edward and Samuel were already sliding into executive chairs at Wilson Manufacturing. My mother's phone calls brimmed with updates about their promotions, their successes, my father's pride swelling each time. She asked about me too, of course, but her voice softened as if she were apologizing on his behalf. I learned to answer with brevity. "I'm fine, Mom. Busy." Because what else was there to say? That I was exhausted, that I lived on instant noodles and ambition, that sometimes I cried in the shower so no one in the dorm would hear no. I saved all of that for myself. And so the divide grew, 2 brothers celebrated as heirs, and a daughter dismissed who was quietly building something no one in that house had the imagination to see. When I left Oak Ridge, I wasn't just driving west. I was running. I was running from the heavy silence of family dinners where my father's voice determined reality. I was running from the shadow of 2 brothers who seemed carved from the mold he valued most. I was running from the echo of his words. Business is a man's world. Clara words that had burrowed deep enough to sting whenever I tried to imagine myself becoming anything else. The road stretched out before me like a dare. Behind me was the neat colonial house on Maple Street with its manicured lawn and perfect shutters, the illusion of comfort. Ahead of me was uncertainty, debt exhaustion, maybe even failure. But at least it would be mine. That first year at Stanford wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the glossy brochure with palm trees swaying over confident students carrying laptops in leather cases. It was me dragging 2 second-hand suitcases into a dorm room that smelled like dust and new paint, while my roommates' parents unloaded SUVs full of Crate's fairy lights and enough snacks to feed a small army. I had nothing to decorate with. No framed photos of smiling families, no posters, no extra blankets. Just clothes, a stack of used textbooks, and a jar of money I had saved through sweat and blisters. It wasn't much, but every dollar in that jar was mine. That fact was both comfort and curse. I had earned it. But I also knew how fragile it was. At night, when the dorm quieted, I lay in my narrow bed staring at the ceiling, the hum of distant traffic seeping through the window. My classmates laughed down the hall, ordering pizza, talking about ski trips, internships, or simply home. Home. A word that felt like it belonged to someone else. I would whisper to myself, "You chose this, Clara. You fought for this. Don't waste it. Don't let him be right." That became my mantra. My shield, my lifeline. Classes were a battlefield. I wasn't the smartest in the room anymore, not even close. Some students had been coding since they were kids with fathers who bought them custom-built computers and mothers who signed them up for summer tech camps. I came armed with library books and nights spent in the high school lab. My hands shook the first time I introduced myself in a computer science seminar. Clara Mitchell, Oak Ridge, Ohio. I said like it was an apology. I worked at the campus computer lab to pay for meals. Most of the time, I helped other students figure out how to unjam the printer or recover a lost document. It was menial, but it came with access to machines I could use after hours. When the lab emptied out, I sat in the glow of the monitors, teaching myself languages I hadn't even heard of back in Oak Ridge. Each keystroke felt like a rebellion. Each successful program felt like proof. Food was a different battle. I stretched my meal plan until it frayed. I learned that a packet of ramen could last longer if you used only half the seasoning. I hoarded free granola bars from campus events. Once in desperation, I pocketed apples from the dining hall, ashamed even as I did it. Hunger made me inventive, but it also made me angry. Angry at a father who had poured tuition money into my brother's business degrees without hesitation, but couldn't spare a fraction for me. Angry at a system where my worth was measured by the wrong ruler. The loneliness was worse than the hunger. During Thanksgiving, the dorms emptied. My roommates went home to big tables and warm kitchens. I stayed behind heating canned soup in the communal kitchen, the sound of the microwave echoing in the cavernous silence. I tried to video call my mother, but the connection crackled, and she had to hang up quickly because my father wanted to watch the game. I told her I was fine. I wasn't. Christmas was the same. The campus was a ghost town, trees strung with lights, but no one around to admire them. I sat alone in the computer lab on Christmas Eve coding until my eyes blurred. At midnight, I closed the laptop and whispered, "Merry Christmas, Clara." The room was silent in reply. That was the taste of independence, bitter metallic, but undeniably mine. Sometimes, lying in bed, I imagined conversations with my father. In them, I would tell him about the programs I wrote about the professors, who noticed me about the quiet victories no one else saw. I would watch his face soften just a little as he said, "I was wrong. I'm proud of you." But even in my imagination, the words felt foreign in his mouth. And maybe that was the hardest part, knowing I might never hear them outside of my own head. Still, there were moments that made the struggle worth it. Passing my first algorithms exam after weeks of sleepless nights. Landing a research assistantship that shaved a sliver off my tuition. The first time I was paid for a small freelance coding job, just a few $100s, but it felt like a fortune. I celebrated by buying a hot meal at a restaurant, savoring every bite as if it were rebellion served on a plate. And there were moments of pride that were quieter, almost invisible. Walking into the lab and not feeling like an imposter anymore. Realizing I could contribute in group projects, not just follow. Understanding that my survival wasn't just survival, it was transformation. I started to see myself differently. Not as the overlooked daughter, not as the middle child forever stuck in shadow, but as someone who was building a foundation, brick by brick, even if no one at home could see it. Still, the ache lingered. On nights when exhaustion pressed down like a weight, I found myself wondering what it would feel like to hear him say the words. Just once. "I'm proud of you." I would shake the thought away, bury it under lines of code, but it always returned soft and sharp, reminding me that independence didn't erase the longing for belonging. And yet, as I lay awake in the dark, listening to the hum of the heater, I knew one truth with certainty. I was forging something real, something that belonged only to me. And whether or not my father ever saw it, that was enough to keep me going. At least for now. By the time senior year came around, exhaustion had settled into my body like a second skin. My eyes carried dark circles that never quite faded. My hands bore the faint ache of endless typing, and sleep had become a rumor I occasionally heard about but rarely experienced. Yet beneath all that fatigue was something harder, something that refused to break determination. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. My first company wasn't born in a conference room with venture capitalists shaking hands. It was born in the clutter of my dorm desk, surrounded by empty ramen cups and notebooks with coffee stains spreading across their corners. The idea had come almost accidentally during a group project where we studied inefficiencies in healthcare systems. While others were content to write the report, I couldn't stop thinking about how clinics, especially smaller ones, struggled with outdated systems and endless paperwork. One night, staring at lines of code that refused to cooperate, I thought, What if I could fix this? The project became an obsession. I named it MediLink. At first, a humble platform designed to help small clinics digitize patient records cheaply. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't revolutionary by Silicon Valley standards. But to me, it felt like building a bridge between my love for technology and the world's messy realities. I poured myself into it. Nights blurred into mornings as I sat hunched over my laptop hair, tied up messily, the glow of the screen painting my face in pale blues. Sometimes I would catch my reflection in the darkened window, a tired young woman chasing something no one else could see. And the thought came to me over and over. This is the version of me he will never understand. This is the version of me he can never take away. The first clinic I approached laughed politely. "We don't have the budget for new systems," the administrator told me. I went home discouraged, but not broken. Rejection was nothing new. I had grown up with it at the dinner table. If my father's dismissal hadn't stopped me, why should a stranger's, the second clinic, listened longer? They asked questions. They wanted to know if my system could be adapted, if it was secure. I didn't have all the answers, but I promised I would find them. For weeks afterward, I practically lived in the lab, patching security features, streamlining code, writing documentation. When they finally agreed to a small pilot, I celebrated by walking to the local diner and ordering pie and coffee, the kind of meal I hadn't indulged in since my freshman year. It tasted like victory, cheap, sweet, and fragile. From there, word spread slowly. Another clinic in San Jose signed up, then one in Oakland. Each new client felt like validation, a whisper against the silence I had carried so long. "See, Clara, you can build something. You are not invisible." Meanwhile, my brothers back in Oak Ridge were climbing higher in Wilson Manufacturing. My mother's calls were full of updates about promotions, expansions, new contracts. "Your father is so proud," she would say, her voice bright, though sometimes with an undertone she didn't mean to let slip. "Edward is really stepping up. Samuel, too. They're making quite the team." "And what about me?" she asked gently. "Are you doing okay, Clara? You sound tired." "I'm fine, Mom," I would say. Always the same answer. Because how could I explain the reality? How could I tell her about collapsing on my dorm bed after 48 hours without sleep, or about the panic that gripped me every time I checked my dwindling bank balance? How could I explain the loneliness of success that no one in my family seemed to recognize? So I didn't. I kept it all inside. The first real check I earned from MediLink had more zeros than anything I had ever seen attached to my name. I remember holding it in my hands, afraid it might vanish if I blinked. I deposited it with trembling fingers, half convinced the teller would laugh and tell me it was a mistake. That night, for the first time in years, I walked into a restaurant where the menus didn't list prices. I ordered steak. I ordered dessert. I ordered coffee just because I could. Every bite felt like rebellion, like telling my father across the miles, "Look, I made something. Without you." But success didn't erase the ache. It didn't fill the hole left by his absence. On quiet nights, when I should have been elated, I found myself staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would feel like if he knew. If he could see me. Would his eyes soften even for a moment? Would he still dismiss it as a hobby? I wanted to believe I didn't care. I wanted to believe independence was enough. But the truth was more complicated. I cared. I always had. The loneliness became sharper as my company grew. Friends celebrated job offers at Google or internships at prestigious firms. I celebrated alone with takeout cartons on my desk and code still open on my laptop. Investors started circling, curious but cautious. They asked for business plans, projections, teams. That word stung, because it was just me. Me and a dream I hadn't dared share with anyone. Sometimes walking back to my tiny apartment, I imagined knocking on my parents' door, sliding into my old seat at the table and saying, "Look, I did it. Aren't you proud?" But the vision always ended with my father's blank stare, his silence heavier than any insult. So I didn't go back, not yet. Instead, I poured everything into Medilink, into proving not to them, not even to myself, but to the world that I belonged. That my voice, my work, my passion had weight. The first time I saw a doctor pull up a patient's record using my software, my chest tightened. Not because of pride, but because it mattered. It wasn't just code. It wasn't just rebellion. It was useful. It was helping. That night, I walked home under the California sky, the stars faint against city lights, and thought, maybe this is what belonging feels like. Not to them, but to myself. I wasn't the overlooked daughter anymore. I wasn't the middle child squeezed out of the narrative. I was Clara Mitchell, builder of something real. And whether my father ever acknowledged it or not, that was enough to keep me moving forward, at least for now. By the time Medilink had grown beyond a dorm room project, I had already built a life far from Oak Ridge. My days were consumed with meetings, coding sprints, investor calls, and the quiet terror of payroll. My apartment was still small, but the weight of the decisions I carried was enormous. I was no longer the girl begging my father for tuition. I was the woman building something he could never take credit for. And yet the past doesn't vanish. It lingers in corners, waits in silences, and rises in unexpected moments. One evening, after another 14-hour day, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. My hair was tied back, my face thinner than I remembered, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. But it wasn't just fatigue staring back at me. It was the reflection of a question I had tried to bury for years. When will you go back? Not back to stay. Not back to surrender. Just back to face the ghosts. For months, I ignored the question. I told myself I was too busy, too far away, too independent to care. But then an email arrived from my mother. Christmas dinner, same as always. "We'd love to see you." Just like that, the invitation unlocked the knot I had been tying inside me. I drove east in a rental car, leaving behind the skyline of San Francisco for the flat, snow-lined roads of Ohio. Every mile tightened my chest. I had built companies, secured clients, handled negotiations with people twice my age. But the thought of walking back into that house, of seeing my father, my brothers, made me feel 12 years old again, clutching a math book, waiting for permission that never came. The Mitchell house looked unchanged, as though time itself had been asked to hold its breath. The same wreath on the door, the same porch light glowing steadily. Inside, the same furniture, the same paintings, even the same faint smell of cigar smoke that seemed woven into the walls. My mother greeted me at the door, her smile bright and trembling. "Clara," she whispered, pulling me into her arms. For a moment, I let myself melt into the warmth. She smelled of cinnamon and something floral, the scents of my childhood. "Mom?" I said, my voice unsteady. I wasn't sure I'd make it. "I'm glad you did," she replied. Her eyes glistened with something like relief. In the living room, my brothers were already there. Edward stood by the fireplace discussing quarterly numbers with my father. Samuel leaned back in an armchair, his laughter filling the room. Their wives arranged presents near the tree, their children darting across the carpet. It was the picture of the family my father had always wanted, sons carrying his legacy daughters-in-law, fitting neatly into the script, grandchildren filling the house with promise. And then there was me. I felt like an intruder in my own home, a visitor to a story that had been written without me. My father turned when he noticed me. He looked older, his hair thinner, his shoulders more stooped, but his eyes held the same hard clarity I remembered. He nodded once. Clara, he said, like my name was both an acknowledgement and a test. Dad, I answered, steadying my voice. The evening unfolded with predictable rhythm. Dinner was set at 5:30 sharp. Grace was said with the same cadence, thanking God for health, family, and the company. Conversations circled around expansions, client relationships, new accounts. My brothers spoke with confidence, their words polished with my father's approval. Each time they spoke, he nodded, his pride visible. When the conversation drifted to me, it was almost by accident. So Clara, Aunt Martha said, leaning over her plate, I hear you've got your own business now. What exactly do you do? All eyes turned to me. The weight of their attention was both foreign and familiar. I took a breath, willing myself not to shrink. I started a healthcare technology company, I said. We build software that helps clinics manage patient records more efficiently. My brothers exchanged polite smiles. My father set down his fork. He said, the sound carrying the same dismissal as always. Interesting. Interesting. A word that meant nothing. A word that closed doors instead of opening them. I smiled tightly, stabbing at my food. Inside, my heart raged. I've built something from nothing. I've worked until my body gave out. I've created jobs, signed contracts, made a difference. And all you can say is interesting. But I didn't speak it aloud. Not yet. The tension came to a head after dessert. My father folded his hands the way he always did before delivering pronouncements. The room quieted. As you all know, he began, I've been reviewing the estate plans. Edward and Samuel will inherit the business as they should. They've proven themselves. They've carried the company forward. It's only right. He paused, his eyes landing on me. Clara, I want to be clear. You won't be part of the inheritance. Your path is different. Different. Another word that meant less. For a moment, silence stretched so thin it felt like glass about to shatter. My mother's fork trembled against her plate. My brothers shifted uncomfortably. And me, I surprised even myself. I didn't cry. I didn't protest. I didn't beg. I lifted my chin, meeting his gaze. I understand, I said. My voice was calm, almost serene. But inside, a storm raged. This is who he is. This is who he will always be. He will never see me. He will never value me. And that's okay, because I don't need his permission anymore. But the words hung heavy in the room. It was my nephew Jackson who broke the silence. He had been scrolling on his phone, half engaged with the conversation. Suddenly, he looked up, eyes wide. Mom, Dad, look, Aunt Clara's on the Forbes list. The room stilled. My father frowned. What are you talking about? Jackson held out the screen. Forbes just released their billionaire list. She's right here. Clara Mitchell, health tech AI, $3 billion. The air shifted, heavy with disbelief. My brothers leaned forward. My aunts gasped. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. And my father? My father looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. Is this true? He asked, his voice strained. Yes, I said simply. The table erupted with questions. How long? Why didn't you tell us? But I raised my hand, and to my surprise, they fell silent. Perhaps wealth commanded a respect my words never could. I built health tech AI 7 years ago, I explained. We developed software that solved diagnostic challenges in healthcare. Hospitals signed on. The company grew. I sold part of it. That's where the money came from. My father's face tightened. You could have told us. I met his eyes. Would it have mattered? You made it clear the only business you respected was your own. The only success you valued was the kind Edward and Samuel could inherit. Nothing I did would have changed that. Silence. His mouth opened, then closed. For once, he had no immediate answer. Inside, I felt both grief and release. Grief for the years spent chasing approval that never came. Release because I finally understood I didn't need it anymore. That night, as the family buzzed around me as children tugged at my sleeve with questions about technology, as my brothers recalculated their view of me, I realized something profound. Facing the past wasn't about changing it. It was about standing in the room where I was once small and knowing I wasn't small anymore. And for the first time, I felt free. The clatter of silverware had just begun to fade when it happened. My father had made his announcement cold, decisive, final. Edward and Samuel would inherit everything. I would inherit nothing. The verdict hung in the air like smoke. And then, out of nowhere, my nephew Lucas broke the silence. His voice, high and trembling with excitement, cut through the heavy room. "Mom, Dad, look, Aunt Clara's on the Forbes Billionaire List." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The words didn't make sense. They felt like static in the air, like a language nobody at the table could translate. "What are you talking about, Gregory? No Samuel?" My younger brother asked, his brow furrowed. Lucas shoved the phone toward him, his eyes shining. "Right here, Forbes just published the new list. Aunt Clara, she's on it. It says she's worth $3 billion. The room froze. Forks hung midair. Glasses trembled in unsteady hands. My aunt gasped audibly, her pearls rattling as she clutched them. My cousins craned their necks to see the screen. Even the children who had been sneaking bites of pie under the table fell silent. $3 billion. The number rang in the air like a bell. I sat there, my face calm, my pulse roaring in my ears. This was the moment I had never planned for yet secretly longed for. To be seen not as the overlooked daughter, not as the one left out of the will, but as someone undeniable. My father's face hardened first into disbelief, then into something rawer, almost fearful. "This must be a mistake," he said flatly, his voice hoarse. "There are plenty of Clara Mitchells." Lucas shook his head fiercely. "No, Grandpa, it's her. Look, her photos here. And the company name HealthTech AI. That's Aunt Clara's, isn't it?" All eyes turned to me. I set down my fork deliberately, the clink against the plate louder than thunder. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't falter. "Yes," I said. "That's correct." The dam burst. Voices, overlapped questions fired at me like arrows. "When did this happen? Why didn't you tell us? Is it really $3 billion? What does HealthTech AI even do? Are you married? Do you have partners? Investors?" For years, I had been invisible at this table. Now suddenly, I was the axis on which the conversation spun. "Enough," I said softly, raising my hand. To my astonishment, they obeyed. Perhaps money had that kind of authority, even in families where love had failed to grant it. I looked directly at my father. "I founded HealthTech AI 7 years ago. We developed diagnostic software that solved cases doctors had struggled with for years. Hospitals signed on. The company grew. I sold part of it. That's where the money comes from." Silence settled again, thicker this time. My father's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in my life, I saw him grasping for words. His empire of certainty had cracked. "You could have told us," he finally said, his voice breaking like dry wood. And there it was, the line I had imagined 1,000 times. "Would it have mattered?" I asked, my voice steady, but burning. "You made it clear the only business you respected was your own. The only success you valued was the kind Edward and Samuel achieved by inheriting your path. You never once asked what I was building. You never wanted to know." The words struck like blows. My mother flinched, tears brimming. Edward shifted uncomfortably. Samuel's face was pale, his mouth tight. Inside my chest felt like a storm breaking. "Say it all, Clara. Don't hold back. They will never give you the moment unless you take it." For years I had sat at this table in silence, swallowing hurt. Tonight, I let it spill. You told me business was a man's world. You told me computers were a hobby. You told me to find a husband, not a career. And all the while, I was building something greater than your imagination could stretch. And still, you would have erased me from the story. You already tried. The room shook with silence. My father's face was ashen, his lips pressed tight, and for the first time, I didn't care. The rest of the evening unfolded like a slow-motion collapse. My brothers bombarded me with questions half out of awe, half out of calculation. Edward asked about revenue streams. Samuel leaned closer, voice hushed, fishing for synergy between our ventures. Their wives smiled too brightly, their laughter edged with envy. The children stared at me like I was a character pulled from a storybook. My mother touched my hand under the table. Her palm was damp, trembling. "Clara," she whispered, "why didn't you ever tell us? Because you didn't want to know. Because you looked away. Because love should have asked, and it never did." But I didn't say that. I only squeezed her hand gently and said, "Because it wouldn't have changed anything." Across the table, my father sat slumped in his chair. The man who had built a life on certainty now looked uncertain for the first time. His gaze darted between me, the folder of estate plans, and the faces of his sons. He was recalculating, I could see it, the gears of legacy, grinding, struggling to reshape me into a figure he could claim. But I would not let him. Later, when the others had drifted away into smaller conversations, he beckoned me to his study. The same study where he had once denied me tuition money, where he had called my dream a hobby. The air smelled of tobacco and old leather. The weight of memory pressed down on me. He cleared his throat. "What you've accomplished, it's impressive." Impressive. The word landed like an insult dressed as praise. I leaned back in the chair opposite him, crossing my legs. "You dismissed my education, my career, my ambitions. You made it clear I would never belong in your definition of success." His eyes flinched just barely. "Times were different. I wanted to protect you. The business world is brutal. 9 out of 10 companies fail. And if mine had been the one to fail, I pressed. If it had been only modestly successful, worth a few million, instead of billions, would you be sitting here reconsidering your view of me? Or would I still be invisible?" His silence was the answer. I felt something inside me shift, like a chain snapping. "That's the problem, Dad," I said softly. "Your respect has always been conditional. Conditional on success, on control, on fitting your story. But family shouldn't be conditional. And I won't live under those terms anymore." For a long moment, he said nothing. His face looked older than I had ever seen it, defeated almost. When I left his study, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow and free all at once. Back in the dining room, the children crowded around me, asking questions about technology, about California, about what it felt like to be a billionaire. Their curiosity was pure, untainted by envy. In their eyes, I wasn't an outsider. I was possibility. That night, as I drove away from the house, snow dusting the windshield, I let the tears come. Not for the rejection, I had already survived that. Not for the inheritance, I had surpassed it, but for the years lost chasing a man's approval that was never mine to win. The shocking revelation wasn't just that I was on the Forbes list. It wasn't the number 3 billion, or the headlines, or the sudden shift in power at the table. The true revelation was this: I no longer needed them to see me. For the first time, I saw myself clearly, and that was worth more than any fortune. The morning after the Forbes night, I woke to the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for explanations. The city was still there. Trash trucks groaned down the alley. Someone's dog insisted on a conversation with a pigeon. A bus sighed at the corner, but inside my apartment meaning had rearranged the furniture. The air felt new, like a room, after you move a heavy couch and realize the rug has different colors underneath. I made coffee and didn't drink it. I stood at the window and held the mug like a prop I no longer needed. The internet had turned my name into a headline for a few hours, and then into a topic, and then into content. It's efficient that way. It spins you until you look like a shape it recognizes. But I wasn't thinking about the article or the number that made people widen their eyes. I was thinking about the girl in Oak Ridge who sat at a long table and learned to fold herself small enough to be allowed to sit there. I was thinking about the woman she became who could pay for the table, the chairs, and the house, and had to find out whether she still wanted to eat there. People kept texting, congratulations, awe, curiosity, advice. A few messages were sharp, with the kind of envy that dresses itself as moral clarity. Some were soft and simple, proud of you. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't avoiding anyone. I was listening to what my life had begun to say when it could finally hear itself. If there was a headline I could have written for the morning after, it would have been this: it was never about the money. Not because money is irrelevant. Anyone who tells you that has never needed it. It was because the money didn't change the shape of what mattered. It didn't rewind the years I had spent translating myself into a dialect my family could tolerate. It didn't cure the old ache that shows up whenever a person you love can't see you without turning you into a role. The meaning of the story, I realized, wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even vindication, though I wouldn't lie and say that part didn't have its own electricity. The meaning was simpler and harder, belonging to myself in rooms that taught me not to. I sat at the small table that had kept me fed through years of prototypes and ramen, and thought about the nights I had argued with strangers who were sure they knew what my company should be. I had spent so much time proving I could build, I had nearly forgotten why I wanted to. The why wasn't a pitch, it was a person. It was the patient who didn't have to wait 12 months for a diagnosis that could be made in 12 minutes. It was the nurse who didn't have to apologize for asking software to be kind. It was the teenage girl who would watch her aunt stand up to a room and realize she could stand up in one too. I opened my laptop and before email could claim me, wrote the title at the top of a blank document, the meaning of the story. It was a dare. It was also a reminder that meaning doesn't arrive like weather. You build it sentence by sentence the way you compile code until it runs without burning the machine down. The first line came plain. I thought I wanted to win. I actually wanted to stop asking for permission to exist. I let the cursor blink. I told the truth in short pieces and didn't reach for elegance I hadn't earned. I wrote about rooms, boardrooms, dining rooms, hospital rooms, and about the way people behave when they believe they control the doors. I wrote about my father saying business was a man's world, and about the dozens of women I knew who kept that world running while men announced that they had invented it. I wrote about my brothers, about the love that had always been there, and the habits that had almost buried it. I wrote about my mother saving articles in a shoebox like a private religion. I also wrote about the parts of me that had benefited from the old arrangement. It's easy to make a villain of one person and absolve yourself of the smaller violences you committed against yourself to keep peace. I had done that too, settled for being brilliant in a way that didn't make anyone I loved uncomfortable. The bill for that compromise had come due long before Forbes. The headline just made it obvious. If a story is going to mean anything, it has to change its readers. I didn't want to write an essay that let people clap without looking at their own rooms. So I made a list not of lessons which can feel like instructions, but of invitations. Build rooms where people don't have to shrink. Choose voice over validation again and again until it's a reflex. Repair what you can with money and what you can't with truth. Sacré. Let love be less interested in control and more interested in companionship. Stop awarding crowns in families. Put out more chairs. By the time I finished the paragraph on repair, the coffee had cooled to the exact temperature of regret. I poured it out and called my mother. She answered on the first ring like people do when they are practicing a new kind of courage. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Which is Southern Ohio for can we talk about last night without breaking?" "I'm okay," I said. "I'm thinking." At last, she joked a quiver behind it. "You always did too much of that. We talked around the obvious like you do when you don't want to ruin a bridge that has only just been laid." Then she said, "Your father wants to try again. Try what I asked, already knowing the answer. Dinner, no speeches, no business, just showing up." I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. The meaning of the story meant I didn't have to perform forgiveness on demand. It also meant I didn't have to perform resentment once it had done its job. "Tell him I'll come," I said finally, "if we can talk about onions instead of inheritance." She laughed the laugh you hear from people who have been holding their breath for decades. Onions it is. The knowing came in layers over the next few weeks. Meaning rarely arrives with a trumpet. It comes like good weather you notice only after your shoulders unclench. No business dinner. Samuel wrote in a group text, and the chorus of thumbs up felt less like compliance and more like relief. My father sent me a separate message. "You are wanted." 2 words. No punctuation. The old hymn would have put a period there that sounded like a rule. The new hymn was learning to let a sentence breathe. That night at Samuel's, while we argued about caramelizing onions and Lucas demoed his app, I watched my father choose a side chair and leave the head of the table empty. Nobody announced it. No one made a speech about symbolism. The chair looked a little surprised to be unoccupied the way a crown looks when it's resting in a glass case instead of denting somebody's skull. The space it left behind felt like capacity. Meaning is not a speech, it's a practice. We practiced. We practiced not interrupting a person halfway through their thought because we were afraid of where it might go. We practiced toasting effort instead of outcomes. Samuel's awkward toast to trying again, badly if we have to, was the kind of line that turns into family folklore if you're lucky enough to survive it. After dinner, my mother led me to a new study. She had painted a green that felt like forgiveness and showed me a shelf where my name lived in frames next to my brother's. "I'm done loving you in secret," she said. Meaning lives in sentences like that. It also lives in the smaller ones she started using later. "No, not today. Do it yourself." She stopped mothering the silence out of rooms just so men would feel comfortable speaking in them. The family began to shift barely at first, like a house settling into new soil. Edward asked me how I decide what to build and didn't flinch when I said I follow the bruises. He sent me a photo of Tyler chopping carrots and said he likes this more than football. I want him to like what he likes. It looked like nothing. It was everything. Samuel told me he was sorry for taking the side shaped like safety, and for the first time I believed him because he didn't ask me to say anything back. My father texted pictures of the dog. "She won't leave the doorway," he wrote. "I think she's guarding our arrivals." He started reading in my mother's memoir class. His paragraphs were stubborn with nouns and light on adjectives like a man who still trusted metal more than memory. "I thought I had to protect the family," he said to me outside the diner one morning. "Turns out I was protecting my pride and calling it the family." Meaning is a sentence that changes how you spend your hours. He started spending his differently. I wasn't noble about any of it. I was elated some days and exhausted on others. The part of me that felt 12 years old would show up without knocking whenever my father used the old tone. The part of me that finally felt my age could talk her down. The meaning wasn't that I had become better than the people who hurt me. It was that I could stop hurting myself long enough to see them as more than the worst thing they had done. At work, meaning clarified like stock. We eliminated 2 features people didn't use, but I had clung to because they were mine. We built 1 feature I had been avoiding because it would require us to admit we had gotten something wrong. I told the team the truth. We were proud of a solution that didn't listen enough. They didn't laugh me out of the room. That's what belonging feels like. Your honesty doesn't cost the room its oxygen. When Forbes asked for a pull quote, I sent the line I had written at my kitchen table. I thought I wanted to win. I actually wanted to stop asking for permission to exist. They ran it at the top, which is the strange grace of journalism on its best days. It pins the right butterfly to the right page and leaves you intact. The first time I went back to the high school, I sat in the dark of the auditorium while a panel of women described the architecture of the lives they were building. A freshman stood and asked, "What if your family doesn't understand?" The room inhaled in sympathy. I didn't stand. I didn't make it a performance. I just told her the truth. I wish someone had told me, "You build a room your truth can live in. You keep the door open. If they can meet you, they're good. If they can't, keep the room." She nodded like a person who had been given both permission and instructions, not a map exactly, but a way to start walking without apologizing for the direction. A few days later, a letter arrived at my office from the granddaughter of the man our family had pushed out at the beginning. She asked for acknowledgement first, then repair. Meaning is what you do next. We drew up a calendar, not a press release. We put money where the pain had been and truth where the story had lied. My father stood by the factory time clock while a plaque was mounted that said exactly what needed to be said. He didn't make a speech. He touched the metal and walked back inside. The workers looked at it and then kept working. That's another thing meaning is it doesn't interrupt the day. It changes it. It would be easy to pretend that writing down the meaning of the story sealed something permanent like a lacquer. That's not how it works. Meaning is less like a trophy and more like a practice log. The family still slipped into its old steps. Edward had a week where he tried to turn Grace into a quarterly objective. Samuel apologized to the dishwasher. My mother overcommitted and then snapped when we didn't notice, and then noticed she was doing it and went for a walk instead of building a case. My father used my sentence about voice and validation as if it were a hammer once, and I told him if he ever did it again, I'd write a sharper sentence about men who wear other people's truths like armor. He didn't do it again. Lucas called the day he broke a build at our company and started crying before he could finish the sentence. Good, I said, not because I'm cruel, but because I know what a mess can teach. Now fix it and write down 3 things you learned that don't make you the hero of the story. He did. He stood up in front of the team and explained the bug like a person who had learned that competence and humility can actually be friends. Emma texted a photo of a robot her club had built out of cheap plastic and willpower and said, "We made it blink." It felt like a miracle. I wrote back, "It is." Then she asked me if I thought she should apply to a summer program or spend the summer doing nothing on purpose. Meaning gave me the answer I didn't know how to give when I was her age: do both. Systems learn while they rest. I kept writing. Not an essay to convince anyone else, an instruction manual to hand back to myself when I got tired. Meaning is refusing the job of carrying other people's fear. Meaning is letting the chair at the head of the table stay empty until you forget it once mattered. Meaning is paying the bill you owe without turning it into a parade. Meaning is practicing love that outlasts control. Meaning is letting your work be useful instead of impressive. Meaning is noticing when you've made yourself small and choosing your full height anyway. One night in early spring, I met my father at a diner that had been the same since before either of us knew what to do with the afternoon. He unfolded a list of names on a napkin, people he owed a letter, people he had wronged, without noticing people he had forgotten on purpose and was now remembering on purpose. He didn't ask me what to say. He had learned that asking for a script is a way of refusing to learn the language. "I'll get a lot of it wrong," he said. "But I am done pretending that not trying is the noble version of not knowing." "Good," I said. "Fail politely, then try again." He told me he had read my line I thought I wanted to win. Aloud to himself in the mirror, and felt ridiculous, but less ridiculous than when I pretend I know everything. We stared at the steam rising off weak coffee, and let the room hold the new arrangement, two people who didn't need to be the main character in order to stay for dessert. After he left, the waitress topped off my cup just because, and said, "You look like you wrote the thing you came in here to write." I told her I hadn't, not all of it. Then I went home and wrote the last paragraphs of the essay that had been waiting since the morning after. Here's what the story isn't. It isn't a girl getting even with a man who underestimated her. That would be too small. It isn't a list of accomplishments that prove worth. Worth that requires a list isn't worth. It's leverage. It isn't a cautionary tale meant to shame anyone into politeness. Politeness is what people use when they don't want to confess relief. Here's what the story is. It's a woman deciding to stop asking locked doors to love her for knocking. It's a family learning to live without a throne and discovering that dinner tastes better when the head of the table is a myth. It's repair that begins with saying the thing out loud and then quietly pays invoices no one will ever see. It's a company choosing to be useful in an industry obsessed with applause. It's a teenage boy who writes an app that speaks to people the way he wishes the world spoke to him. It's a mother hanging her daughter's face where visitors can't miss it. It's a father who writes to the people he hurt and doesn't bargain for absolution. It's a line that says, "I am enough not because of what I've achieved, but because I am mine," and then a life that practices being true to it on days when the line feels like a heavy thing to carry. I hit save. I didn't send it anywhere. I printed it and taped it inside the cabinet where I keep the coffee. I knew I would see it in the mornings when I had to decide whether to teach my day to belong to me or to someone else's fear. Meaning isn't for audiences, it's for practice. A week later, I walked into the factory where the plaque had already become part of the way light hit the wall. The floor manager, a woman who had been there long enough to remember my brother's first summer jobs and my disappearing act, stopped me by the break room. "Your father is different," she said. "He doesn't talk as much. He listens like it's work. It's disorienting." "We like it." "He's trying," I said. "So are you?" she answered, shrugging as if to say, "Welcome to the club that meets every day and never adjourns." She handed me a styrofoam cup of bad coffee that tasted like the kind of honesty you don't perform. On my way out, I passed the time clock and saw a young man standing in front of the plaque with his arms crossed, not in defiance, but in consideration. He looked at me and away and back again. "My granddad used to talk about this," he said, tapping the edge of the metal with a knuckle. Nobody believed him. "It's good to see it in print." "I'm sorry it took so long," I said. He nodded once. "Me too," he said. "But it's here now." Outside, the winter light made even the snow look warm. I thought about the first time I had stood at that table in Oak Ridge, eating pie like a person concentrating on the apple to avoid the knife. I thought about Lucas shouting my name and about the quiet afterward. I thought about how the story had started long before I was born, and how I had spent most of my life trying to find the place where I could write the part only I could write. People sometimes ask me now, that there is distance between the headline and the life what it all means. They want a sentence they can quote at conferences. I give them one if they need it, because sentences can be keys even when doors are stubborn. It means I learned to belong to myself and then built places where other people could do the same, I say. If they want more, I tell them about the dinners where we toast the things we're still bad at. I tell them about the dog who refuses to leave the doorway. I tell them about my father's list and my mother's green study, and my brothers learning to ask questions that aren't strategies. I tell them about the way Lucas's app says, "Want to take it now or in 5?" and how often I choose now. Sometimes they look disappointed, like they expected a story about a dragon and a sword and a mountain of gold. I don't blame them. We were all raised on those stories. This one is less cinematic and more useful. In this one, the treasure is a table without a head, a room where the air doesn't thin when you speak of family learning how to be a chorus instead of a contest, a life you can stand inside without shrinking. I used to think the moral of my story would be something about grit. It's not. Grit matters, but it can make you worship suffering for its own sake. The moral of my story is about gentleness with the parts of yourself you had to hide to be allowed to stay. It's about telling the truth early enough that it doesn't have to explode. It's about paying your debts, the ones with dollar signs and the ones with names, and then refusing to live as if debt is your personality. The night I realized this for good, I wrote a line on a sticky note and pressed it to the bathroom mirror. Because meaning is what you practice, where no one can clap for you. Let the story be a house you share, not a weapon you carry. I brushed my teeth. I said it out loud. I turned off the light. In the morning, the room had that good after a storm feeling, the smell of clean air and rearranged clouds. I made coffee. I opened the cabinet. I read the essay taped inside and didn't feel like I was asking too much of it. I poured a cup and texted my mother dinner this weekend. Onions are on me. She sent 3 heart emojis and 1 knife. My father replied with a single word, workable. It made me smile. I drove to work with the windows down the city, offering up its ordinary miracles. A kid on a skateboard holding a bag of bagels like a crown, a woman laughing into a phone, a man petting a cat through the bars of a stoop. In the office, I wrote the day's list on the whiteboard. Listen, repair, build rooms. We did what we could and then went home, not because the work was done, but because meaning asks you to rest too. That night, I sat on my balcony, the blanket around my shoulders and the streetlight rehearsing its halo. Across the way, someone practiced the same piano piece they'd been practicing for months. I could hear the spot where they always slowed down the measure that never came easy. I waited for it. They got closer than the last time. Not perfect, better. That's the other meaning of the story. We get better at the part that used to undo us. And when we don't, we try again tomorrow with less shame and more light. The table will be set this weekend. There will be onions. The head chair will stay empty. We will get some things wrong. We will put the wrong fork on the left side of the plate and laugh and fix it or not. Someone will make a toast. It will be about effort. The dog will sleep in the doorway guarding the arrivals. And when I drive home, I'll say the line once just for me, so I don't forget what the story is. For I am enough, not because of what I've achieved, but because I am mine. And then I'll walk into a room that knows my shape and start again.